Good evening. So first of all, let me say that it's remarkable that at 5:30 folks would go, hot dog, let's go to a meeting. So I appreciate you being here. When I was asked to come down and speak, I thought what I would do, because we're going to talk about leadership. And if you look up the term leadership in the dictionary, there's, I think, like 29 different definitions. One of the first goes to direct the actions of others to achieve a goal or objective. So telling people what to do. If you go on down around 19, it's to provide guidance and counsel in alternative courses of action. To provide guidance and counsel in alternative courses of action. And so when I was asked to speak about leadership, and when I think about leadership, I tend to embrace that latter definition as opposed to the first definition. And as I use as an example the acknowledgement and apology that our community worked on, I think you'll see how that definition is more effective in building bridges across racial lines that are a challenge for the communities that many of us live in, and particularly during the political times that we're experiencing now. So about 2012, 2013, I'm in my office, and one of my captains come in, and she says, "You're not going to believe what I just heard in the hallway." Now, I've been police chief in LaGrange since 1995. A little bit about LaGrange: it's a little over 30,000, about 48% African American, 44% white, and then we have about an equal mix of Latino and Asian. And so police department's just under 100 folks. So for 20 years, I'm working in that community, and for a lot of reasons that I won't have time to go into. Crime, of course, disproportionately affects those in poverty, and African Americans disproportionately represent folks in poverty. So I work closely with the African American community, and over time felt confident that our agency had built a trusting relationship. I think, what many folks do. They confuse individual trust with institutional trust. They may trust you as a member of an educational system, or they may trust you as a member of a police department, or they may trust you as a member of some other organization, but that does not mean that they trust the institution. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And some of them, we'll talk about, and some of them we probably won't have time to address. But certainly I want to cover some of the historic harms and the consequences that we're dealing with today. So she comes in and she says, "You're not going to believe what I just heard in the hallway." Now, our police department's got 3 floors. I'm on the 3rd floor, and in our hallway, much like you go into other government buildings, you see pictures of the old timers. In our case, it's going to be police officers that served turn of the century, 1900, early 1920s, 1940s, through the 1970s. And she tells me there's 2 African American women, elderly, and as she walks by, one of them points to one of those historic pictures and says, "They killed our people." And Andre tells me this, and she's African American, and I said, "Do you know what they're talking about?" And she said, "No, I don't." So I started doing some research, and what I found is that in 1940, and this is another, I think, phenomenon that the white community doesn't appreciate. A lot of historical harms are not covered in our history books. They're not taught in school. And because we don't know about it, we assume other folks don't know about it. Well, those stories are passed on from generation to generation. And so the African American community knows about it, the white community doesn't. And so as I do research, what I find is that in 1940, a young man was arrested for assaulting a white woman. Now in 1940, that could be anything from a physical attack to a black young man not averting his eyes as he passes a white woman. He's taken into custody. He's brought down to the LaGrange jail. And within 5 hours, 6 individuals in hoods come into the jail and take him physically from the police. Now, there ought not be a safer place in the universe than a police department. And if they take somebody from the police in that era, you can almost guarantee that the police are complicit. I didn't find a police report. I didn't find an investigation. I didn't find where a search was initiated. I didn't find a prosecution. He was discovered, ironically, about 9 miles outside of town in a place called Liberty Hill. He'd been shot 5 times, and he was still alive when he was discovered. He was taken to the hospital and died a short time later. On the 6th page of the LaGrange Daily News was a little article, and it just was titled something to the effect, "Negro Shot." And then it indicated that there was some confrontation and he was taken from the jail. It was, however, covered extensively by Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Because during that time, between 1870 in 1960, there were 5,000 lynchings in this country. And in the 1930s and early 40s, there was an effort in Congress to pass an anti-lynching law, a federal anti-lynching law. It was stalled in the Senate by Southern Democrats. And as a result, that law was never passed. But they used Austin Calloway's case as an example as to why this law should be passed. So I'm reading this, and then I discover that a Reverend Strickland, who's with Warren Temple Methodist Church, which is an African-American church there in LaGrange, he appealed to the local authorities to do something about Austin's lynching. They didn't respond, so he petitioned the National NAACP, and the attorney at that time was Thurgood Marshall. So I was able to find correspondence between Reverend Strickland and Thurgood Marshall, who of course later was placed on the U.S. Supreme Court by President Johnson. And in that correspondence, Reverend Strickland was asked, well, have you appealed to the local officials? And he said, yes, I have, and they have chosen to ignore it. That's the way they've dealt with it. They just ignored the fact that this young man was taken from the city jail and lynched. As a result, that episode created the interest in the African American community for the NAACP. And that's what you find if you start looking at the history of the NAACP. Oftentimes, it's one of these issues, or it's either voting or lynching or some sort of abuse that's directed at members of the African American community. Now, I said there were 5,000 lynchings between 1870 and 1960. Mississippi is the state that had the most. Georgia is second. There were over 500 lynchings in Georgia. Those incidents were used to terrorize the community. They weren't all African Americans. that were lynched. About 2/3 were. The other third generally tended to be whites that were sympathetic or supportive of African Americans. So I learned this information in 2012, 2013, and I come to understand that this happened over 70 years ago, but it still affects the relationship between the police and the community they serve. Now, I don't know how many criminal justice majors we have in here, but I can tell you that the young men and women that I hire, good heart, want to serve, want to make a difference, and they go into these communities that are frustrated by what they understand to be the history of the police. And so they're greeted with what? Anger, frustration, hostility, suspicion. And what's the reaction? Well, it's a human reaction. And that human reaction oftentimes validates what folks think about the police. And why do we respond that way? Because we don't understand the history. And if we understood the history, we might look for opportunities for that venting to occur, and then maybe pause long enough where we can show them that the way you understood the police behaved in the past is not the way we behave today. And that's the challenge. As a result of the work that we've been doing in LaGrange, when I was IACP president, the year or two before, Michael Jordan had given us $1 million and for community initiatives. And so when I became president, I said I want to use some of that money to start a trust initiative. And part of that trust initiative was what we call listening sessions, where we go into different communities, we ask the police not to be there, and we listen to what the community has to tell us about what frustrates them about the police, what angers them about the police, what they like to see differently about the police, and what they like about the police. What are the things they're doing right? We did those listening sessions in Albany, New York, Ferguson, Missouri, Sacramento, California, and Fort Morgan, Colorado. And I was speaking to a group in Ferguson, Missouri, and this would have been about 1.5 years after the riots. And a woman in the front row, middle-aged, black lady, she says, "I got a question for you, Chief." I said, "What's that, ma'am?" She goes, "How come you don't understand your history? Why don't the police understand your history? Why don't they understand what they did during, how law enforcement was used during the times of slavery? How law enforcement was used during the civil rights movement? How law enforcement was used when there were lynchings?" And that's a good question. Why don't we know our history? Why don't we teach that? And so, as a result of that experience, we started at the police department. There's a book. It's a guy by the last name of Branch. I can't remember his first name. It's called Parting the Waters. And it documents from about 1925, 1930 through 1968, the civil rights movement. And it does a very good job of documenting the police involvement in obstructing the civil rights movement. So I read that and I gave it to my training lieutenant and said, I'd like you to pull out all the instances that you think, and there's, in Georgia, there's plenty. And let's take also our local history here in LaGrange and let's create a civil rights history for police. And some of our officers that were raised there were aware of some of the things, but they never never made the connection between systemic racism and just the way things are in the South. For example, white pools, black pools, white recreation centers, black. It was just a given. It was accepted. That's the way that the South rolled. And as they began to understand how that impacted not only them, but the African American community. It created, I think, some opportunities for our officers that otherwise would have been missed. So going back, so I've got this information, and I'm trying to decide, how to address it. And a couple of years go by, and the mayor comes in, and he says, and this is just before Ferguson, he says, we have 3 cities in our county. He said, I've been meeting with the mayors of the other 2 cities and the county commissioner, and we're going to initiate some trust building training. And I'd like you to participate if you're interested. And I said, Mayor, no offense, but I've had it up to my neck with sensitivity training, cultural training. I had it in 1973 when I went in the Air Force. And it's, a lot of talking, very little action. And to the mayor's credit, he didn't insist. He said, well, I just wanted to make you aware it was going on and give you an invitation. I said, well, noted, thank you. And then as I began to see who was going to be invited and how the class was going to be made up, it was 40 folks, and it was split down the middle between whites and blacks with some from the Latino and Asian community. Kind of at the last minute, I said, yeah, I think I'll attend. Excellent training. It's put on by an outfit in Richmond, Virginia called Hope in the City. And it forces you to have conversations that you need to have before you can have the conversations that you ought to have to address the issues in your community. And what I found from this is that trust building is very difficult work. It's very frustrating work. You're going to get mad at the folks you're working with, both the whites and the blacks, but you pledge to keep coming back. And I was telling Harold, and I think maybe Bob, is one of the black preachers, I think, and anytime I get frustrated in a situation, I remember his quote, if you're going to be a bridge, don't be surprised if you're walked on. If you're going to be a bridge, don't be surprised if you're walked on. So if you're going to be a bridge in this kind of work, and that work is effective, guess what? You're going to come away frustrated because it ain't always going to go your way. You're going to come away wanting a different outcome. It ain't going to come away. It's not going to come away that way. So as we're working through the trust building, after it's a day and a half training, it does a couple of things. One is it increases your sphere of known folks in the community. So when you're thinking about doing an initiative, you're not going to the same 3 or 4 folks. You're now bringing another 12, 14, 20 people in that in the past you hadn't worked with. And the other thing that it did is it got you all on the same playing field in terms of understanding where each of us are coming from. So how does that relate to leadership? Well, a recognition, first of all, that if a community is going to work on the kind of issues that we have that are represented in historical harms, which impact economics, education, public health, crime, public safety, there isn't a social issue, substance abuse, homelessness, mental illness, there isn't a social issue that doesn't have a racial component to it. And so after we went through the training, we would meet about every other month or sometimes quarterly. We'd have a breakfast and we'd have a speaker. One of them I spoke about, some of the stuff that we do at the police department as it relates to either training or use of force, that sort of thing. In August of 2016, they hosted a woman who is from Harris County. That is the county right south of us. And she, I think, was a reporter, lived in D.C., raised in Harris County. And she started, as she got older, she started researching her genealogy. And she knew that her grandfather was a sheriff, but then she started researching newspaper clippings and things that went on, also through church newsletters, that sort of thing. And started unearthing some skeletons with some of the older relatives, and found out that her grandfather, who was sheriff, had been involved in some lynchings. And so she wrote a book. It's called Family Tree. And of course, the tree representing the branches in her family, and then the tree that also represents the families that were lynched. And in her research, she found the granddaughter of the guy that her grandfather had lynched. And they started working together. So she does a presentation on this, and I got her book, and I went up to her. Her name's Karen Brannon. And I go up to her afterwards, and I told her, what I had learned, and I said, are you aware of a police department that's addressed this issue? I was looking for some kind of a model to follow. And she says, no, I haven't. So I said, all right, well, thanks. And I see the NAACP president on the other side of the room, Ernest Ward, school teacher. We've had, a respectful relationship, not a particularly close one, but we did do the racial training together. And so I go up to Ernest and I said, hey, Ernest, I'm thinking about doing some sort of acknowledgement or apology for the Austin Calloway lynching. Is that something you'd be willing to work with me on? Graciously and immediately said yes. And he said, there's a group that's been researching lynchings in this area. I think they're 12 to 14. And he said, would it be okay to invite them? And I said, well, sure. So we started meeting in August. We realized that if this was going to be something that was going to be effective in our community, that we needed as many folks representing different aspects of the community involved. So I reached out to the college president, LaGrange College, which is the oldest private college in Georgia, asked him if he would work with us on it. He said yes. Reached out to the pastor of Warren Temple. He said yes. Reached out to one of the state court judges. She said yes. Reached out to one of the members of the Calloway family, of the young man that was lynched, and she said yes. And then we had some other folks that represented different aspects of the community. Some of them went to Liberty Hill, where it was, just to get a sense of what that area was like at that time. It's relatively unchanged. If you go out there at night in September, it's dark sky, illuminated by stars. You got kind of a battle between tree frogs and the cicadas. And you can just imagine some young man, your age, being snatched by folks with hoods and taken out in the middle of nowhere, what his last thoughts were. And not one institution represented in LaGrange did anything about it. Grand juries in Georgia are charged statutorily when they meet to look at the jails. The only government document I could find where there was a comment about Austin Calloway was in a grand jury presentment. And it was a single line that said the LaGrange City Jail needs better locks. That was the extent of institutional comment. So as we're working, and we decide that, Austin had his funeral at Warren Temple, so we should maybe have the apology and acknowledgement there. Pastor Dominic graciously agreed to host it. He'd been involved with us. I had not talked to any members of my police department. So every year we have an inspection in December. So I've got everybody there, got all the cars lined up, got all the troops lined up. And I told the division commanders, before we have the inspection, I'd like to address everybody and just kind of share something with them. And what, it's kind of a knoll there so I could get up there and chat with him. I said, let me tell you what I've been working on. Let me tell you what I'm looking at doing. I said, I'm not so far committed to this that I can go another direction if you all can come up with a better way to deal with this. But when I've got elderly black ladies in the police department referencing stuff that we did 70 years ago, it needs to be addressed. I said, if we look at the inherent discrimination that went on, I said that you can look at the old city ordinances and see what kind of black codes we enforced. Less than an hour from us, Tuskegee, Alabama, where they had the medical experiments by the U.S. Public Health Department from 1929 to 1972, where they intentionally withheld treatment for a curable disease so they could track the progression of that disease like you would a lab rat. Mississippi appendectomies, where African American women would go in with some sort of a minor ailment and would be told that they have an appendicitis and they would be unknowingly sterilized. That's the history. So I said, if you put all that, and then in Troup County, at the time of the Civil War, there were 128 counties in this state. We were the 5th largest slaveholding county. So many of the folks that live here that are black are descendants of slaves. And so they know this history. And so if we're going to make and effectively work with folks, we got to let them know we understand that history also. Of course, nobody said anything. But as I was leaving, I was heartened by the fact that I got about a half a dozen texts. That's the way you all communicate. I got about a half a dozen texts that said, Chief, you're doing the right thing. So we have this is something now that we just worked on locally. About 2 days before the Atlanta Journal-Constitution got wind of it, and they put out a story on it. And the day we were doing the apology, I went to lunch and I come back and there are news trucks all over the PD. I had CNN in one room, I had ABC in a conference room, another conference room, I had NPR downstairs, I had another. I mean, we were just overwhelmed with it. And I asked the reporters, I said, I understand that, this is unusual, but really this I thought would be kind of a local, maybe state story. I said I didn't expect it to have international appeal. And we had folks there from Germany. And the tenor of the remarks from the folks covering it is that this is so unusual and people are so frustrated with what they hear out of Washington, D.C., that they want to hear about a community that offers hope as opposed to antagonism. And that's the challenge of leadership. Anybody can tear down a bridge. It's a lot harder to build it. As a country, we are changing. And if we don't get on top of this history and we don't address it effectively, then in my opinion, we're going to miss some opportunities to come out of the next 10, 15, 20 years in a way that complements our generation as opposed to perhaps what we see with the leadership that unfortunately in both parties in D.C. So we meet with, we have the interviews, and then we do the acknowledgement. We had such an overflow that we had to get another building and run a live feed. And what I came away with in that experience is that if you're going to do something that is going to contribute in a meaningful way, if you're going to do something that's going to have a positive impact, then it's got to involve different folks. It can't be just conservatives or just liberals. It can't be just progressives or traditionalists. It can't be just Republicans or Democrats. It means that even though we may not agree on many things, we agree on one thing, which is what we all want, which is a good community to live in, a good community to raise our kids. And you can't have that kind of community if folks don't work across political lines, racial lines, ethnic lines, or religious belief. People have got to roll up their sleeves and be prepared to do the nasty little work of agreeing not to agree, park that stuff that's real controversial and start working on those things that you agree. And what you find is that as you work with folks, the things that you really thought you were far apart on, you ain't so far apart. You're not so far apart. So we have the acknowledgement and the apology, and in 3 days I got almost 200 emails, letters from across the globe, as far away as Australia, Europe, India, and a bunch in the United. I only got 9 negative ones. Not one from a serving police officer. I got 2 from retired police officers, but not one from a serving police officer. As a matter of fact, some of the most heartfelt ones were from police officers who in essence said, finally. About a week later, I get a call from the FBI Academy, and they say, hey, we're doing training on the value of acknowledging past harms. And I'm getting some pushback by some of the folks in the classroom. Now, the National Academy has 250 students from across the world. It's 11 weeks. And they're broken up into 5 50-student sections. And he said, would you mind coming down and talking, or I guess coming up, I'm in Georgia, coming up and talking to the class? And I said, sure. As a matter of fact, I may combine some where you can get as many of them as possible. I said, happy to do it. So I go in, and about half of the folks immediately are with me. The other half I can tell not so much. Arms are crossed, chins locked. But towards the end, about 90% are with me. The ones I had the most difficulty with were the foreign ones from outside the United States, primarily Europe. Since the acknowledgement and apology, those are words. What happens after the words? What happens after the words has to be deliberate. So what are some things the police department did that's deliberate? One of the first things we did is we recognized that because crime disproportionately affects African American communities, the police are going to be in there more. I mean, that's what I look at. I look at what we call heat maps. And a heat map is where the crime, based on where the crime is, you put resources. But as a result of the police being there, kids get caught doing stuff that they probably wouldn't get caught if there weren't so many police there. You know, in my neighborhood, you don't see a cop unless you call them. So my son or daughter could do something, you know, a little bit on the indiscretional side, and the police wouldn't be there to deal with it. Black community, not so much. And so a lot of the times you'll see arrests, but no convictions, because it gets to the prosecutor and he goes, I'm not going to. But today, everybody gets a criminal history when they apply for a decent job. And they get that criminal history and it shows an arrest. And there's 2 piles. The pile that they're going to interview and the pile they don't. And guess where the pile the arrest goes? They're going to interview. So they don't get the chance to explain the facts and circumstances, because they don't get through the door. The legislature passed a law some time ago that allows that record to be restricted from employers. The problem is you got to go to the police, you got to go to the court clerk, you got to go to the prosecutor, you got to go to the judge, and every one there's a fee. Now these are folks trying to find a job, and they got to jump through loops and hoops, and they got to pay for it. And so we thought, what is it we can do to facilitate that? So we called a meeting together with prosecutors, judges, court clerks, and we said, if we have an ombudsman from the police department that walks these through, will you all waive fees? And they all said yes. Our first record restriction was a year and a half ago. We had 152. We just did one 3 months ago, and we had, I think, 250. I saw a little old lady that I'd worked with in the first one, and I said, "Hey, what's going on? What you doing here? You just supporting the record restriction?" And she drops her head, and she goes, "No, when I was young, I was stupid, and I just don't want that on my record." That was something that haunted her, that created an opportunity that was life-changing for her. So, record restriction. Vehicles that have equipment failures, headlights out, taillights out. We make the stop, but what we did is we went to all the parts stores and said, "Will you all sponsor a coupon for 10% off, and we'll rotate giving it for the business. And when we stop somebody," and we can check our computer and see if it's somebody we stopped before. And if we stop them before, they get a ticket. If we haven't stopped them before, we give them one of these coupons and say, "Hey man, just telling you your headlight's out. Can you go get it fixed?" What's that do? That knocks the edges off of an enforcement action. What's the purpose of enforcement? To get compliance. When the legislature meets, they meet and they create laws to solve problems. When the police use those laws to beat hell out of people, that's when the public resents it, and the legislature starts pulling those tools away from the police because they don't feel like they've used them appropriately. I can name 24 different initiatives the police department's been involved in, either before or amplified after the acknowledgement and apology. Trust doesn't get you a pass. If we have a police shooting, had one last week, what it does is it buys you the time to get the facts. Those agencies that don't have the public's trust are the ones you see on TV. When whites hear of police doing something wrong, they go, well, the police generally, they're pretty good guys. This is just somebody that, screwed up. When blacks experience the police doing something wrong, this is a page in a book in a library full of misconduct that they've suffered at the hands of police. So it's two different perspectives. And if we don't understand that, then we're not going to see much change, which we haven't in the 50 years since Watts riots. You see these same communities where unsettled peace, bad outcome, riots, protests, unsettled peace until it's cyclical. And we keep doing the same stuff over and over. And the challenge, in my opinion, for folks that are in criminal justice now and looking to go into criminal justice, is to look at the way we've done things in the past and don't do them. Do something different. All right, I got the high sign from Harold, which means wrap it up for questions. So are you moderating, or do I just say, anybody got a question?